Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Well, this is going to be an interesting conversation because I have recently been in contact with today's podcast guest because she's been writing some very interesting blog articles about an area that we've not really touched on before in the podcast. I'm going to let her introduce herself in a minute. But also I had the very great pleasure of seeing her present on some areas of research that she's very interested in up at Sheffield Hallam, part of a symposium organised by the grandfather of the non-linear pedagogical and ecological approach, Keith Davies up at Sheffield Hallam. And really interesting stuff. So Marianne Davies, welcome to the Talent Equation.
Hi, it's really nice to be here.
I guess starting point, as always, is you've got a great story. And we've recently just discovered, before we even started recording, that we both grew up in, or we both lived in, a similar part of the world in North Wales. And anyway, just take me through your journey in the magical world of sort of coaching, coach development, skill acquisition, the whole piece.
Right. I think I've been very lucky. In many ways, I've sort of been pulled off piece lots of times, but it's actually sort of all come together nicely in the end because of that. So as I was saying, I had a sort of moved around a bit as a child, which was interesting. Spent some time in a Steiner school, which is sort of very much about the individual and learning and playing and exploring. And then ended up in North Wales as a sort of climbing and working with horses is what I wanted to do. And had a child quite young, which was my first sort of being pulled off piece slightly. But I then went to university in Bangor, and I did a bachelor degree with Lou Hardy and John Fazy in Bangor. And they just finished doing they'd done their cusp catastrophe curve theory, and John was really into his ecological dynamics. So in the early 90s, I was studying, motor learning, motor control and skill acquisition, very much from an ecological, it's dynamical systems, it was called then, dynamical systems or action systems. And I was fascinated, absolutely fascinated. And Sarah Skate, who was with us last week in Sheffield, is now working with Tony Oldham. I don't know if you know him. No. And he was a postgrad there at the time, and he was studying ecological he was studying dynamical systems. So he would be the person I'd go and chat to, about all of that stuff. So very early on, I did try and stay on in university, and again got derailed slightly by life. But so I'd always had this fascination from the early 90s with dynamical systems theory, ecological psychology, and try to apply it to my coaching and coach education and the stuff that I did, which was pretty tough. I was on a slightly different page. I do remember saying to some people, it's not so much that I feel like I'm on a different page. I seem to be in a different library to quite a few of the people that I'm working with. They look at me as if I'm crazy. So I went back to university just before I moved back to Mold, and did a research master's. And what I wanted to look at was the relationship between skill acquisition and motivation. So I wanted to pull the psychology and the motor learning together. And I did my research on the influence of motivation and self-determination and behavioural regulation on skill acquisition. So rather than it just being about well-being, what was the effect on skill acquisition? I was very lucky to manage to get a distinction in that, which I had to really work hard for, because I was working at the time as the coaching manager for the national governing body for paddle sports in Wales. So I had lots of experience of supporting a workforce, working, and I'm sure this is very much stuff that you're aware of, trying to find what the rate limiters were within the entire system. And sometimes that meant, trying to persuade a government agency to change one of their rules, or maybe one of the county councils to change how many people they would allow in a swimming pool with a boat, for example, so they could play polo because it'd been capped at 4. So there's some things were easy to change, and then other ones were more difficult. And I started writing my blogs because some of the more difficult things to change were some of the really ingrained things that the coaches had been taught about things like skill acquisition and learning. My, drills like you was one of my bugbears. VAK, people would spend half a day out of a 2-day course talking about whether somebody was a visual or an auditory learner. And I'd be hopping up and down on my soapbox trying to not upset them. And so I decided that the easiest way to have an influence was to try and write in a way that would engage. Yes. It was different to what was out there at the moment. And actually to try and write in, my effort is to try and write in a way that is more in line with an ecological dynamics philosophy. So I try and find a true story experience, and then make that narrative something that people can get engaged with. They can read it and engage with it. And then I try and write it like a detective story. I'm not quite there yet, so that I'm sort of giving some cues and leading and some handrails so that the reader can effort, they're having to work a bit hard. It's a bit effortful, but they're getting to a conclusion in the end that I'm not making them come to. So I'm not trying to go, this is the fact, and I'm going to tell you a good story that backs it up. I'm trying to create a search space for them to explore. Yeah.
Which is no mean feat, I imagine.
No, it's I don't think I always get, I'm trying. I don't always get it right. And I do get a few people saying, I wish you'd just tell us the answer. Can you give us some more concrete examples? And I go, no, I'm not telling you the answer.
Where would be the fun in that?
It's there for you to go and explore.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So, well, actually, no, starting point. You said something really interesting, that sometimes you feel that you're not on a different page, you're in a different library. Tell me more about that, because I definitely can resonate with that. And I've been having some interesting conversations on Twitter with some people like that, and in the process of shaping a reply to one of them. However, tell me more.
Yes, I think that's probably, we're probably experiencing the same thing there. So I'd sort of be having these conversations or exploring something and thinking that we're sort of vaguely talking along the same lines, and then realizing that actually I've got a reality in my head that is so different to theirs. And a recent conversation I had with somebody who's a really good friend, is somebody's knocking downstairs, who is a really he's one of the development coaches in a national governing body, and the response was, this is all really interesting, but essentially an ecological dynamics is just a coaching style, isn't it? And I was like quite taken aback, and I thought, we use all the coaching styles, and I sort of thought, that's for me, that's a little bit like saying that that whether or not you think the Earth is flat or round depends on the budget you have to send, something up in space. That it's dependent on something changes that reality. So that's a good example. And I would realise actually I put a lot of effort into something that I haven't really got any traction to change, which was one of the reasons why I wanted to go back to university, because I thought first of all, I can explore these things, and it's okay to think differently to other people, and it's okay to explore those concepts, and I'm not stuck within a system. Although having people like yourself in the system makes me think it would be great to work in development again, because I was a development officer for quite a long time, and I could do massive stuff, but then I'd come against these brick walls that I couldn't change because the people who were who were sort of controlling the rules, as it were just in a very different place. And it was too far away for me to have a conversation. That's a different library. There was no common ground to start.
Right. And it's interesting because I feel like that a little bit myself, in the sense that, part of me started this podcast because I wanted to try and reach out and connect with people who'd had some similar experiences and were struggling, or discovering, learning, exploring kind of this slightly different conceptualization of human learning. And what I've discovered on this sort of interesting journey in audio has been just how many people there are out there having similar experiences, and yet I still think, weirdly, it's still quite niche. And talking about ecological dynamics, or ecological principles. Now, interestingly, it is becoming, in my view, and I'm certainly finding this in my day-to-day kind of life, but it's becoming a little bit more mainstream. And when I say it's becoming mainstream, it's not. But it's not that you're not using the same language that people often talk about, things like systems thinking or systems leadership or complex systems, which in my view are very aligned, or systems innovation, very aligned to and very clearly taking their thinking and ideas from dynamical systems theory and ecological principles. So it's becoming a bit more mainstream in my kind of day-to-day work, which is quite gratifying and interesting to see. But I think it's also a significant struggle, because often when talking about these ideas, I see people looking at me with a degree of suspicion, as if to say, that sounds a little bit kind of woo-woo and out there. And, oh, yeah, he's one of them, isn't he? He's one of those who talks about all this kind of crazy stuff. But actually, we really just need the numbers. We just need to, hit the KPIs and the targets and all that sort of stuff. So, I definitely have felt that, even though I do feel a shift. But you've obviously been at this game for quite a long time, and trying to embed it within the sports system. Probably we were doing that in parallel, but in different sporting contexts. So, yeah, just interested in some of those experiences, really, and kind of how they sort of manifest themselves.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's really, it's really interesting you saying that it still feels a bit niche, because when I went back to university in Bangor, it was a very, very quick piece. Assumed that dynamical systems, now ecological dynamics, because they've pulled ecological psychology into it, would be the only thing they were teaching, because it was having its paradigm crisis in the early 90s. And it wasn't until I'd signed up that I realised that actually they've gone completely the other way, because the staff had all changed. And I ended up with two supervisors who were definitely in the in the sort of cognitive and schema theory, and I'm like, oh no, what have I done? So I'm trying to do my research with a psych and a skill act supervisor who are saying to me, well, it doesn't matter, does it? It makes no difference whether you look at it from a dynamical systems perspective or from a cognitive information processing. And I'm going, it makes a massive amount of difference, because you might do the same thing, but the reasons why you're doing it are totally different. So that was the first bit. So that was a bit of a shock to me, which is why when I decided I was doing a PhD, I went, well, I'm going to be really cheeky and ask Keith Davids to supervise me before I even choose a university. But like you, I'm really excited actually at the change that there has been just in the last 2 years. It's suddenly masses and masses. So I've been sort of playing around with these ideas and being able to influence the people around me, and quite a lot in paddle sports. Lots of people who I've worked with are sort of, I think now, feeling that they're a little bit ahead of the game, because they're recognizing it from the stuff that I did and things that I was able to do in that position. But I was very limited. in what I could do, which was quite frustrating just because of, you know, the position I was with. And I sort of was feeling a bit disappointed that I still felt that I still felt a little bit ahead of that curve, whereas, you know, it didn't feel like I should be because of what my experience had been in the early 90s. And I think just within coach education and a wider thing, it just takes longer for something to change, doesn't it? It takes, which is one of the reasons why when I try and write, I'm trying to be, you know, using things like, you know, the ugly curve, and I love things like the handrails and handcuffs thing that you talked about with Ollie Logan, and I talk about, you know, snow rabbits and poo sticks, and because they're ways of me explaining something that means something to other people, and they don't have to understand the complexity. And I think that complexity isn't in the education system, so it's not the way people think. And that changing the way they think is the struggle. So, like, you know, like my friend who said, but it's just a coaching style, isn't it? They want to just shoehorn ecological dynamics or constraints-led approach or something like that into their current coaching toolbox as a tool, rather than think differently, but maybe have all the same tools but just use them differently.
And that's the mistake, interestingly, and again, that's very, very that resonates a lot with the conversation around. I think people make the mistake that ecological approach is well, firstly, it's just a tool or a different kind of, you know, conceptualization and all that sort of stuff, and I don't agree with that at all. I think when you embrace kind of an ecological lens, or you place an ecological lens on learning and development in a sporting context, you end up in a scenario where you almost can't see development in any other way.
Yeah.
And
I agree.
That's super dangerous. It's super difficult for me, I find, because it makes me, and I get accused of being dogmatic, and I get accused of being, you know, an extremist and being on kind of just one side of the fence and not embracing everything and all those sorts of things. And that's not necessarily the case. It's just that when I, you know, the more I kind of work, the more I start to immerse myself in these kinds of ideas and conceptualizations, the more I begin to think that any other approach is somehow artificial, false, unreal. You know, I don't know why. It's just there's a different idea that's going on. I mean, I don't know if you've experienced something similar.
Yes, yeah, for sure. And I think part of it is that once you see things that way, it for me, it's, and this might sound a bit extreme, but it is like that. You know, do you believe that the planet's a sphere, or do you think it's flat? Do you believe in God, or do you not believe in God? They're almost incompatible ways of thinking. So if you're going to look at it through one lens, then the other one actually can't exist in that same reality. You can switch and look through it, but what you see is different, or how you see it is different. And I think, like you, and a lot of people say, you know, used to say to me, "Oh, you're brilliant. You're a disruptor." And I'm like, I don't want to be a disruptor. I'm only a disruptor because I'm trying to enable, and I want to be an enabler. But in order to enable the people and the opportunities that I can see, it disrupts the people that are, you know, that in my view are holding on to ideas that limit that. You know, and some of them do, and you know, and like I say, one of the, with things like the whole, you know, the idea of people having a particular learning style, and it's visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, and you know, within paddle sports, people, you know, at UKCC level 2 would spend half a day coaching this, and then the rest of the time explaining that that's how people learnt. And I remember watching, working with a friend of mine who was a level 5 coach many years ago, and watching this session. And they had 3 people who were open canoe paddlers, you know, open canoeing. One of them had never, hardly been in a boat before, and had just scraped past the personal requirements to be on the course. One of them was somewhere in the middle, and the third one had spent 2 seasons in the Ardèche working as an open boat leader. So they had completely different experience. And the person I was working with, I showed them, you know, a bit of a novel, interesting Gucci move that she didn't think any of them would have seen, and let them have a go. And the guy who'd spent 2 seasons in the Ardèche went, oh, that looks really good, and rushed off and had a play with it. And the person who'd never been in a boat, had rarely been in a boat, said, oh, I don't understand what you're doing. Can you show me? So I'm stood on the bank doing this sort of naked coach session, talking about, how you can see clearly that he's scaffolding, the experience he already has, that he's got really good, perception action coupling, that he understands what he's doing. He's able to explore and experiment, and that this other person doesn't. They need more information because they haven't got any experience to build on. And then at the end of it, the person I was working with came off the water and went, isn't that a brilliant example of somebody who's a kinesthetic learner and somebody who's a auditory learner, and I know for the next 2 days I'm going to just talk to this person and send this one off to do what they want. And I was like, oh no. And of course, I'm the junior coach in that situation, and I just thought, I've got to do something about this. And I realised that actually it wasn't something that was meaningless. That idea was actually then going to affect their development, because being told you're an auditory learner, especially when it's a perception motor skill like paddling, and then you shutting out the other forms of information is going to prevent good development. So I realised that actually this whole idea of the BAK, which I know isn't an issue anymore, it's moved on a long way. This is 8 years ago. But I realised that actually,
don't be fooled. It's still pretty prevalent.
That actually the people who need, the people weren't being encouraged to use the perceptual information that they needed to develop the affordances that they needed. They were being pulled away and almost, they were being handcuffed, use all these things, into paying attention to information that wasn't actually useful to them. And then, and somebody also that I spent time with sent me, they'd failed their UKCC level 3 for not coaching the candidates in their preferred learning style for the entire day. And he said, you know what, every time I changed tasks, it changed. And I went, well, I bet it would, because their experience level would have changed. And, actually it tells you more about their level of ability than it does about a spurious learning style. and what you need to be able to do is look at it and go, what information do they need to become attuned to? Not what, what can I scaffold that? What experience can I scaffold that onto, rather than just make a really quick, simplistic decision. So that's when I started being a bit more disruptive about it, and then thinking, actually, it does matter what lens you look at it through, because those learners are not being best supported.
It's a fundamental. It's a total different. It's a different conceptualization of the learning process. One for me is knowledge driven, content driven, and is based around an idea of idealized technical modeling, and approaches towards idealized technical modeling through I guess a linear approach of learning technique, applying technique, and seeing and the illusion of transfer.
And that's work. Go on, sorry. I was going to say that.
No, carry on. No.
That's more down. I think as a female, I see that more, because those technical templates would tend to be elite adult male templates. So, the ideal technique. So people who are not included already are affected more so by being expected to be able to replicate those.
So that's actually a really good point, and actually something I'd not fully appreciated, I don't think. The technical based on, like you say, elite adult male, and then we'll work backwards and we'll make some assumptions. At this age, at this age, at this age, at this age, we're going to look at that, and then we'll just transfer that across to a female audience.
Yes, and anyone who's not at that level, all they can do is be told what they're doing wrong. So and what it is that they're, the feedback is on, what's not okay about their performance at that moment in time, rather than looking at the performance and saying, what do they need to be developing now in order to become more skillful?
And and in that conceptualization, it's inherent in that conceptualization that if there is a technical model that's deemed to be the most efficient and effective route to achieving whatever performance task is in front of somebody, then by its very nature, that leads you towards correction of correcting any deviance from the technical norm. And therefore, the coaching process involves a process of assisting an individual correct their deviations.
Yeah, which is why we have robots. We use robots. And have you read the first developing skill article that I wrote, the listening to the elite?
I don't know if I have.
So I talk about conversations I had in the 90s with a brilliant paddler called Aled Edwards, and then with this really amazing climber called Johnny Dawes. And listening to them
I have read it. It was brilliant. Yes, go on, carry on. Sorry.
Listening to them describing what they did,
yes.
And me just thinking, this is like a sci-fi film. This is a reality I have no access to, no concept of. And that was incredible. And I started talking and listening to more and more people, being curious. And one thing that really struck me was that the people who were really, really good at stuff, really elites, and I'm, and that's, I was in the mountain rescue, so I was talking to, helicopter pilots and people, mostly outdoor stuff. So it's like horses and, outdoor adventure stuff. And they would all start off by saying things like, can't believe I'm still alive. The things we used to do when we were kids, we mess around with this, and me and my mates would go and do all this stuff. And I got to thinking, this is really interesting, because it seems like the people who are elite are the ones that had an opportunity to do all that exploring and experimenting without being corrected early on. So they got good before they were coached. And then I'm thinking, as a coach, that's really quite a disturbing thing to think about, that actually, and I would have sit there watching somebody who's brilliant and went, I bet they weren't coached. They'd have been told not to do that.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the biggest danger for me, is that kind of early intervention coaching model robs the athlete of all of the opportunity for exploration, because whether it's explicit or implicit, the technical norming is always around them, and therefore they become, so almost like you use this phrase, and you'll talk about this later on, I'm pretty sure, about this idea of learned helplessness. I don't think it's deliberate necessarily, but we are essentially creating a generation of young people with a learned helplessness, because they are constantly just looking for this all-knowing other to determine whether an action is appropriate or not, based purely on its aesthetics. Yeah.
And to one particular standard.
Yes.
That doesn't fit other people. And again, as when you think about participation, you go, you're never going to have participation in an NGB or a sport without getting away from that. And interesting, I spent this morning actually writing for a dressage judge, which was brilliant. And she does a lot of para. So we had a little chat, and that's fascinating, because I can't look at the rider because they're not doing anything right. It's not technically correct. So I have to look at the horse and the outcome. And she said, and it's brilliant, I love it. And she really likes my articles. One of the reasons, she said, I think about the stuff that you've written and the ugly zone stuff. And that ugly zone is we can talk about that, but the reasons for doing that was this idea that people think that has to be perfect, or the only option is that you're going to fall off the end of this, catastrophe curve. So they keep pulling back to try and make it perfect, because that's what you do if it's an information processing concept you've got, is that you're making something technically correct. So you groove that technical correctness. And if you go too far over the edge, you don't know what's going to happen, but at some point it's going to all go horribly wrong, and you're going to fall off this catastrophe curve. And so the whole idea of sort of creating that ugly zone model was so that coaches in their heads could go, actually, where you want to be is where it's a bit wobbly, and between it being brilliant, because obviously you can't stay there all the time, it'll be exhausting. So having the confidence to be somewhere where it's brilliant, but playing in and out of that where it goes wobbly and goes wrong, and not being scared of it going wrong. not thinking it has to be perfect. And if it's not perfect, you're learning poor technique. And I hear a lot of coaches, pulling people back just as I think it's getting really good. And they go, the technique's going out the window. And I'm like, no, this is the first time they're actually starting to do something. This is the first time they've really connected, or the first time they're really engaged with what they're doing. This is where they need to be. And like, no, they're going to learn how to do it all wrong. And they pull them back. Mm. So I wanted something that was visual, that showed that. And that is, being able to go in and out of there, I think, is where, you talk about this generation not having an ugly zone. It's either okay or it's not, because they don't know how to play in that space where they might make mistakes and it's not quite going right. And and it doesn't have to be dangerous. Most of the time you're playing in the ugly zone. It's like thinking about the way a musician would just like dig deep and play somewhere, or somebody would boulder on a bouldering wall where it's safe, or so it's not about it being dangerous, but about just really playing and experimenting with that perception action coupling, and not worrying about it looking technically correct, being able to really explore that search space, as Keith would say, that perceptual motor search space.
And that's a really key element to this as well, because just sort of floating back to what you were saying a little bit earlier is so if you are following this journey around this idea of, you're always trying to correct towards a perceived technical norm, well, some of that is a subjective. So it's based on an individual's interpretation of that technical norm. Sometimes individuals determine their own technical norm. Forget them, they've got it wrong. This is a better technical norm. But the thing for me is, and it's really pervasive, is that there is this association or assumption, and this is what I mean about this illusion of transfer. So what people tend to see is, and this is this hugely counter-cultural dynamic. So I'm reading David Epstein's latest book at the moment, Range.
Yes.
And I'm hoping to get him on the podcast if I can ever make his schedule work with mine. But anyway, the first sections of the book are really fascinating and actually quite illuminating in terms of what we're talking about. It's this sense that if people learn something, or they're taught something and they're shown something, and then they can then follow that and whatever, and then they can do it, they tend to feel very satisfied with that experience, and they will report, very often that individual, kind of teacher or whatever is a good teacher. And if they learn from somebody else who perhaps is, using a more kind of exploratory, interleaved approach that's a little bit more difficult and a bit more struggle, but, they have to work towards it. Then they'll often report that teacher isn't as good a teacher, and they'll get lower kind of ratings and satisfaction scores. But whenever they look at the kind of outcome and the impact of the two learning methods, one outweighs the other by miles. So the ones that have that kind of interleaved approach, they do far better in retention tests, etc., etc. Now, this is a different context, right? But it's translatable in terms of, I think, that counterintuitive sensation that the learner has, and therefore the coach has, in terms of the satisfaction of their participants. So what I think we often do is we have coaches who run these sessions that are structured and ordered and everything else, and by the end of it, people go away and they're smiling and it all looks good and everybody's been able to learn. The learning outcome has been achieved according to the session design. So my view is, if you ever get that, that's when the alarm bells should start ringing. Right? Because actually something entirely different should have happened. Firstly, I don't think you should have necessarily started with a learning outcome. You should have started with an area of exploration. But that's indicative of how different the two paradigms are. One says, that's the outcome I want to get towards, whether it's a technical, a tactical one, or whatever. The other one says, here's an area of exploration that the individuals can now discover various movement solutions. They're just at opposite ends of a consideration spectrum.
And I had this conversation this morning, which is really fascinating, with the lady I was with, because she was saying that within every coach development, or certainly all the ones that she's done, it says you need to show an improvement in skill at the end of your 40-minute lesson.
Yeah.
And the way to do that, like you say, you go, okay, well, that's really easy. We'll just do block practice. It'll be repetitive. You know, it's really easy to do that. All the things that we know from research lead to poor retention and transfer. And that's the, you know, so my early research was the contextual interference effect. And I did, you know, I had my research published in 95. And because that was the thing that I was really fascinated about, that. So you're right. So at the end of a session, you know, my lecturer used to say, if you're a bit confused, that's brilliant. And if, you know, people were saying, yeah, I understand that, at the end of the session, you'd be, damn, I haven't taught you anything because you've just slotted it into your current knowledge base. Yeah. So, you know, the whole thing with the contextual interference effect is that, you know, if that more effortful processing, that coordinating and then re-coordinating movement patterns, making decisions, doing something else, remaking that decision is what creates learning and exploring those options. And that's completely opposite to just drilling something, which might make it look pretty on the outside, but there's no learning happening. It's being processed completely differently. It's just sitting in working memory, or, you know, you're not reassembling a coordination pattern. However, that's what we've come to expect, and that's what people who go to buy a coaching intervention want. Yes. So, you know, like you say, and if you don't give them that, they think you're rubbish. And then they go to someone else who tells them the answers and they go, oh, they're brilliant. Yeah. And this is where, you know, as I was talking about on my talk last week, it becomes interesting, because then you say, well, if you're coaching something like an adventure sport, an equestrian sport, where people are going to be spending most of their time participating without supervision, then they need to learn to be able to make those decisions and make mistakes and recognize what's happening and come back from them and analyze their own performance and development. Because without that autonomy, it's simply not safe. The environment isn't safe, which is, I think, why those, you know, British Canoeing and the other NGB's adventure sports are looking at that more closely, because that's such an important part of what they do. They're not going to be just in a tennis court doing something. People are going to be in environments where they need to be able to make decisions and adapt and be autonomous. So it's difficult. And then there's the motivation bit, that, you know, if somebody just struggles while they're with you, they're really going to come back. They're going to think that was really good. So maybe, I don't know what the answer to this is. This is one of the things we were talking about this morning with my friend who I was writing for. And she was saying, you know, maybe we need to do a bit of both. But you have that conversation with the learner and say, you know, there are some things I can give you so that, you know, that will help. Some things that are really easy to deal with, maybe things that they've been taught poor technique, because that's one of the other things. What's ideal technique changes, doesn't it? So, you know, you get people coming in, you're going, oh no, that was so yesterday, we do it like this today. You know, this is new school, perfect technique. And try and find a way so that towards the end of a session in particular, you're doing things that will support them feeling motivated as well, so that they've got that balance.
And interesting. So is that a sort of conclusion that you might have come to, which is to provide some of those, because this sort of circles back to something else I wanted to dig into, which is this idea of kind of the motivation and the psychology of motor learning. And so are you saying then that it's a little bit like something I've talked about in the past, like almost like a broccoli burger type scenario, where, you know, you're saying, well, you know, if you give a little bit of a treat of something that they kind of will feel good about, and then that'll give them the motivation, but then you then go send them back into the ugly zone to explore and then come out, and then maybe help them to come out of the space. So I understand that, right? So it's a little bit the idea, you know, eat your broccoli and then you can eat the nice stuff, whatever that is, you know, that you want to eat. Whereas I feel like what I'm trying to do is to almost create the broccoli burger, which is something that's both tasty and nourishing. Yes, that absolutely. And that's where I think the whole concept of the ugly zone comes in, that we need that as people, you know, if we're doing our job right as a coach or coach developer, or even as a performer, finding a way to operate at that there where you're playing in and out of the ugly zone, so that becomes where you want to be. I mean, when I talk to Aled Williams was brilliant, because when I sent him the ugly zone article to have a look at, he was so excited, and he's like, you see him just light up, become really animated, and he stood in front of me with his arms out, and
almost describing like a circle around him, going, that's where it's really fascinating. That's where I love being. That's that's where the magic happens, and I find new ways to do things. And so that's the whole thing, that becomes the place you want to be in, rather than the place you're afraid of. But it's like, to get there, the motivational side for me is most important, because you're not going to go there if you don't have autonomy, you can't pull back out. If you don't feel safe with people you're working with, so if you haven't got that sense of belonging and that relationship, the side of it. So we talk about self-determination theory. And if you're not able to be competent, and again, feel that you can come in and out. So it almost becomes a prerequisite, which is why in my pinched Newell's model and adapted it a bit, I put those things at the beginning. The Maslow before Bloom. And if that's not there, there is no ugly zone, or it gets too small. It's collapsed through ego or fear or worry. People aren't going to go in there unless you create a safe space for them to do so. And that's a bit more complex. It's a bit more of a juggling act. Well,
yes. But I wonder if the skill of the ecological dynamicist, invented a new word, is to design a space, like you say, that search space or that exploratory space that is ugly enough.
Yes.
So it's not as pithy, right? But perhaps it's the slightly unattractive zone.
Yes. Well, that's why it's so big, and it goes all the way from being awesome to a bifurcation point into, a new way of doing things. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's about being able to dip in and out, and to play in it.
And that's why I think your point about the idea of handrails is useful, because for example, and why I like that metaphor, because, for example, if you're learning to move or walk or whatever it is, you see people, for example, who've had, say, a stroke or something like that, and they're learning to walk, and what they're doing is they're holding onto the handrail when they feel unsteady, but then taking their hands off in order to try and then relearn again. And it's like, I'm not completely free in the room, because I know if I do that, the likelihood is I'll land on my face. So I've got the handrail, but I can take my hand off. And so that's the sort of what we're talking about metaphorically, isn't it?
It is, yes. And the handrail, and because they've got the autonomy to get hold of the handrail again when they need to, it takes away the fear, doesn't it? Of, that you need to know that you can do that. That you can dial it back down and go,
yeah,
that got a little bit too pithy. I'm gonna go and give myself a nice stroke and feel better, and then I'll go back in again.
But that's the issue, isn't it? I mean, I think as people become less conditioned to the pure and simple reception of information sources from the coach, they I think then begin to appreciate the ugly zone more, and in fact begin to ask for more ugliness.
Yes.
Yes. And actually the moment you begin to take away some of that genuinely exploratory discovery stuff, they actually start to get really quite resistant and a bit like, what the hell are you doing? Get out of my space here. I'm just in this discovery world. Or, and when they start to come to you and are deliberately trying to ask you to find ways to make this uglier, more challenging, more stretching, and all those sorts of things, then you're beginning to kind of you've managed to sort of reframe their way of loving that exploratory space.
Yeah, definitely. And my doing stuff with my son is brilliant, because he's obviously we experimented on him from the age of about 2.
We have a similar story where we have guinea pig lab rat children. It
was brilliant. Yeah, Tony obviously was hilarious. Like, excellent. I've got my own. I'm in university. I've got my own lab rat. It was brilliant. But so he and I would watch him and his friends. I built them a rail in the garden because they got into their skating. I just watched them spend hours and hours and hours just doing this, what looked like the same moves to me, but they clearly went all subtly different stuff to them. And you'd have to drag them back in. Yeah. And he'd be doing the same thing in his boats. We played polo together on the same team, which was brilliant fun and hilarious. Only once in a tournament did he accidentally shout "Mom." And and he does that when we ski together. He does that, and and he's great. And he always says, like, I think the one thing that's fascinating is that I know I can learn. I understand how to learn and to play and explore and experiment, and that's brilliant. But yeah, and if he doesn't get that, he gets bored and he doesn't want to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And which is, in my view, one of the reasons why so many young people find their school experience so unrewarding, because it's content based, just learn this, remember this, regurgitate this, and now you have the knowledge, and now you've got knowledge, you're in good shape. Whereas for me, I think that process of exploration, discovery, understanding something, beginning to find a way to create connections between things and all those sorts of things, that's the little bit that's robbed. Now, a part of that, I think, is just a feature of time. So it's the design, the environmental design, the curriculum design, all those sorts of things. I'm not blaming teachers. I'm not having a go at teachers. I'm saying, I think, you know as well as I, that one of the things that you do need to be able to be in the exploring in the ugly zone is time.
It's time.
It doesn't always come immediately.
No. But like you say, once people recognise that that's where they want to be, then and it's, they can do the stuff in between. I mean, I sent my son to a club, a canoeing club, when he was 8, thinking he'd love it because he was doing it with his mate instead of his mom. He hated it. Really? I talk about that in one of my motivation blogs, because he came back and refused point blank to get in a boat. And I was like, how can they put my child off something he loves in one session by sending him to a club, a proper club? And when I spoke to him about it, they didn't let him be with his friend. They didn't let him mess around like I would do and do the stuff that he wanted to do. He had to sit still and behave, and he was freezing in this pool, and then do exactly what they told him to do and do it correctly, and then sit there again. And so all of those self-determination things were just completely, undone in that one session. But 10 years later, at the age of 18, he met the guys from the Bangor University canoe polo team, who were amazing. I mean, it was an incredible group, and they're still doing amazing stuff now, all of them. And just sitting around the table, having some banter with him for half an hour, he got back in a boat. And then was so passionate about polo, he chose his university. He wouldn't take a year out. He went straight to university. He didn't choose it well, because he went to Imperial College and then discovered that they weren't part of the UCL, and he couldn't play polo for UCL, which he was gutted about. But that, I just thought, that's fascinating, that we talk about, and this is the Maslow before Bloom thing again. And so it wouldn't matter what you did in terms of correct technique training. If you can put somebody like him, who's already passionate about something, off so easily, and then he can be inspired so easily to do something, and go out with them in the middle of winter, and practicing on the Menai Strait, which what it looks like, to practice his polo. This is too important to not be embedded right in skill acquisition.
Now that's interesting. So that's one of the most dangerous bodies of water in the world, the Menai Strait. So that's right there in the ugly zone, right there, isn't it? That's on the edge of catastrophe, as you were talking about there.
And you play polo on a pool on flat water, but they used to train there because it was the only bit they had. So it wasn't anything to do with them wanting to have something that was nice and comfortable. And interestingly, when I read the Sport UK thing on motivation and participation a couple of years ago, that I can't remember what it was. Martin Chester was one of the people who did it, and I thought that was really interesting, because when it spoke about the things that people were put off by, it wasn't any of the ones that I had heard as a development officer. It was their initial excuses, but they're not the stuff they talk about further on down the line, because that was much more about, not feeling included, not feeling, or feeling that the coaches didn't respect them, or that the national governing body would turn up and tell them what they were all doing wrong in their club, to clubs that were, but when you ask them, they go, it's a bit expensive, or I haven't got access and stuff. But when people are passionate about something, and the horse world's classic, they will do anything to continue to do it, including practicing polo on the Menai Strait in winter.
Talking about that, I'm just thinking about the Menai Straits as a environmental constraint, and whether that had any effect on their skill levels, because they're obviously having to participate or practice water polo in an environment that's firstly really quite inhospitable on occasion, but also got significant levels of, so for example, the current, not least of which, and the tide and the potential, for, the fact that, the water can be really quite unstable and stuff. Did that have any effect on then their performance when playing in a flat pool?
Well, they did win. They got bowled at Bucks or Booster or whatever it was. It did change that year. So yeah, it's the only time Bangor have ever been gold. I don't think that will be the only reason.
Right.
They played on the Menai Strait. They practiced on the Menai Strait. They practiced on Slimperdam, which is the lake. Being student, it gave them extra hours without being, one of the reasons was that the pools had a cap. You can only have 4 boats in. That I managed to uncap, thankfully, by being in the position I was at the time. But for sure, they did a lot of that stuff. One of them was Robbie Anderson, whose father, I think he still is actually part of the performance team in British canoeing. Another one of the guys was Joe Leach, who currently has the record for paddling around the UK in a sea kayak. He already was a good sea kayaker, so he was, the polo. But it was because of the way they played and practiced. They were just incredible. And for me, that was really important. And they won gold. They won, and then Bangor University sort of fell off the tables again, league tables. But at that time, they were committed. They messed around. I mean, they spent time, like you say, playing in lots of ugly zone areas with absolute passion and loving it. And they were a very close group. They were, so all of that sort of motivational climate stuff was there. And you just get this, this amazing burst of excellence.
So you're sort of leading me towards this sort of obvious question, I suppose, which is, how does one go about designing a learning environment based on kind of an ecological conceptualization of learning in paddle sport?
In many ways, a lot of that's quite easy because once you get into the environment, once you get off the flat water and onto moving water, you have your environment.
Yeah, it's there.
And it's there, yes. And then it's about playing with it. And actually, most of the coaches who are awesome, I watch them, and they do create these incredible search spaces, and they do it really skillfully. And then I listen to them running certainly the old UKCC courses, and go, what they say in that and what they do are very different. They're hugely skilled, but when they're sort of passing on the information off the syllabus, they're just giving a syllabus, and it's not what I see them doing. Yes, it's actually quite easy. On the flat water, it's not, because it's easier for someone to take it out of context.
Right.
Like the ergo and the drills. When you're in the moving water, you're not doing that. I think maybe a good example is an early experience that I had with a coach who was brilliant. In fact, he, I believe you know Matt Giblin. Yeah. So Matt and I worked together at Surflines in Llanberis, and the head coach, which was brilliant. The head coach who was there ran a session for us, all of us, where he took us down to Plassybrennan, and we played on the water there that's not very big, so it's quite a gentle flow, and they had all of the gates up for the slalom. And what he did is he had us, and it was a real classic for me, a real classic playing in the ugly zone session. He had us doing things like we'd set up a loop, a route through, so you have to sort of break out in this bit and go through the slalom gate in this direction. And then he'd say, right, you can only use your right paddle blade. And so we go through it, and we'd have to come up with a whole load of different solutions, because we couldn't do it without putting our left paddle blade in the water. And so you're suddenly doing lots of things like, cross decks, but it immediately changed the way we sat. We had to sort of be much more dynamic in our body positions. We had to use our edge more. We had to, so we had to make different decisions. And that was classic. And again, he couldn't get us off the water. That's always good. We finished, we're going, I want to do one more run. I want to see what happens when I do this, and I was like, that's brilliant. in climbing you can do the same thing. On bouldering, you play, we call it like it's an elimination game, isn't it? You just play with the rules and the boundaries to get the movement patterns that you want, and you can do that as well in paddle sports, really easily. And I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of the really good river paddlers started by doing slalom, because they had the opportunity to play on the same bit of water again and again and again, and mess around and get used to it, and try different things and experiment and explore.
And so you've got an environment that's naturally variable.
Yes.
In the sense that you've got different flows and this, that, and the other. So that's cool. But then how do you therefore go about, for example, if you wanted to manipulate that environment some way, what would you do? I mean, I can understand a task constraint, for example, and provide, so like, use one blade or use a blade in a certain way or whatever it might be. So I can sort of get that. But what about then if you were to look at sort of other constraints of, like, for example, I'm thinking, how do you manipulate the environment when to a certain extent you've only got a certain amount of control over how the environment can be manipulated?
You do only have a certain amount of control, but there are definitely lots of different environments, and a lot of the environments will have different levels, so the places that people use are the ones where there's this huge amount of variability. For example, there'll be sections of a river where there's a tiny bit of flow and a little bit more and a little bit more and a bit less. Sections of the coast where you've got different, more sheltered and less sheltered places where you go when the tide's not there. So in the Menai Straits, sometimes the day it's completely flat. Other times of the day you've got a massive, great big hole there, or a huge wall of water or something. So you can sort of move around in that environment and pick it. But then there are other things that you can change, like the type of boat, how balanced it is, how connect. Some are definitely much more forgiving than others.
Right.
So there's lots of other things that you can change.
Oh, yeah, that
and the tasks. So there's a massive amount. And when I coach, I usually take like a whole bunch of different paddles and different boats so that people get used to being in something that's slightly different. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So do you have, for example, different blade sizes, for example, things like that? Do you have access to that kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, I remember at Surflines where I worked with Matt, when I first started working there, I sort of was leading the 2-year water-based. It was the sports science and outdoor education degree at Bangor, and it was just their water-based module, their practical module. So I was leading that, and Matt and a few other people working with me. And only because of the time I spent in university, I was one that had the academic background. And one of the girls there had a couple of years of paddling experience, and we were doing some sessions on Llyn, and I was watching her and thinking, I don't quite understand why she's really struggling. This isn't making sense. And then I suddenly looked at a paddle, and she was about 4 foot, if that. She had this huge paddle. So I ran off and got her one of the kiddies ones and gave it to her. And, oh my goodness. And she was just like, she just went, for the first time in 2 years, I can paddle. I can't believe this. But I mean, she'd just been having a fight with this huge paddle before then. So of course she thinks I'm brilliant. And all I've done is given her a small kiddie's paddle.
That's of an appropriate size. Yeah.
Made such a difference. And another one that was similar was an assessment that I was doing, and I was watching this girl, and it was for an outdoor centre. So they had centre boats, and they were open canoes, and it was huge. They buy the biggest, heaviest ones, because they think then anybody from the biggest man to the smallest child can get in it. But the problem is the smallest child can't manoeuvre them, and neither can people who are light and things. So she could barely manoeuvre this thing. It was like a tank. But it was really, really windy, and because she was so light, I was watching her going, she should be able to, she looks like she's doing all the right things, it should work. And then I looked and thought, I can see air between the boat and the water. And she's basically flying a sail rather than paddling a boat, because she wasn't heavy enough.
Yeah.
So the boat wasn't connected to the water, so it was just blowing all over the place regardless of what she did. And I went and got a whole load of big stones and put them in the bottom of the boat, made it heavy so it was actually sitting in the water, and then she just styled it. She just paddled around with absolute grace and ease. and that, and quite often those are the things that really make a difference, being able to look at something and
so not content with kind of an environment like adventure sport where you're exploring and discovering around the whole kind of an ecological approach to kind of learning and developing in those contexts. You've decided to challenge yourself even further by bringing in to use Newell's triangle. So we're looking at the interaction between a task and an environment, but we haven't just got one performer, we've got two. We've got a human one and an animal one.
Yes.
Because you're now beginning to explore the conceptualization of how we can apply some of these ideas within an equestrian context.
Yes.
So talk me through that whole equestrian world, because this is an interesting area for me.
Wow. So making this short's the hard bit, and making it not seem like it's awful. So the equestrian world, like I say, is very well established. So we've got really strong traditions and very, very powerful as sort of forms of life in terms of the influences of its past. And why and where it's come from and the reasons. Because obviously equestrian disciplines haven't come from sport originally, and they're still sort of very much wrapped up in the idea that the horse has to be completely submissive to the rider, and that is also changing dramatically. But one of the interesting things about equestrian sports is they've always sort of just they've sort of gone, well, we're not really a sport because we're different. So they admit they're quite a long way behind in terms of having an understanding of skill acquisition and learning. And even at Bangor University, it's really interesting. So at Hartbury's, I think this was amazing. So although I'm doing my PhD with Keith Davies as my primary supervisor, I'm doing it at Hartbury, so I've got access to an arena and the horses and things. And Hartbury's fabulous because it's an animal place, and it's got a huge, incredible sport department, very much into the rugby, and an equestrian one. But the equestrian one is not animal and it's not sport. They're quite adamant that they're neither. It's separate, and, which makes me chuckle because but that's sort of quite very typical. And so it's very steeped in tradition, and I just thought, it fascinates me because every time you're on a horse, the bit that was on my slide that I'd forgotten in my talk last week is that you're never just a performer, because when you're riding, it's a bit more like coach education, because you're a performer and you're still influencing your horse, and your horse is either learning or unlearning from that experience. And I have had a friend of mine who's quite well off has said to me, a close friend of hers bought a very expensive horse, very, very expensive, well trained horse, and then said to her it was worth it for the first 3 weeks because after that she'd kind of unraveled it and trained it. Just because it's a complex dynamic system. It's responding to and changing in a way that a boat or a ball or a bat doesn't do. So that relationship and that interaction is more like the way in which we would look at something like our economy, where people's behavior changes what happens, rather than so it's much more complex. So you've got this complex system that's a dyad, that's half horse, half human, that is supposedly performing towards a shared behavioral outcome in a sport or anything else that we're doing. And horses do that. Horses are very good at connecting.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because so you've got two organisms that are independently complex adaptive systems coming together to form a new complex adaptive system.
Yes.
That's pretty unique, really, isn't it?
It is unique, and that level of connection. And I, there's a couple of reasons why I chose to do it. One, it fascinates me.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I two, I think that if I can find a way to make that work, then and as my son's doing some research in ecological dynamics within exploration, which is completely separate. So he's looking at mineral exploration. But if we can make it work across those two boundaries, then there isn't really anything that you could say is exempt. And we know it works for a lot of the other sports. So for me, that was the other thing. And also, I think the equestrian world needs it, because it doesn't, I think the really good, and there is masses of really, really good stuff in the equestrian world. If that had the ecological dynamics theoretical framework around it, then all of the disparate disciplines and things can hang together, and there's a way of moving forward and making a decision about what is and what isn't good equestrian sport, and what for the horse and for the person. So I just felt it was important as well.
Yeah, no, it is. So you it's interesting, isn't it? Because you were sort of talking about how I guess the traditional form of, say, rider instruction is based around riders. Firstly, again, there are sort of some technical norms around, kind of rider positioning and appropriate rider form as a means by which to, I guess, transmit information to the horse and to have more control. But it's always based on rider control, as opposed, if I'm right, you could tell me if I'm wrong here, but the instructional method is very much based on rider do this, rider do that, and if rider does this and rider does that, rider gains control of horse, as opposed to not control of horse. And control of horse is the way of deeming good ridership, I suppose, as opposed to the flow of information from horse to rider as well, and how the rider can adapt to the flow of information, perceptual information, both visual and proprioceptive, etc. And then, so the rider having an intuitive understanding of the information that is coming from the horse, either through the movement or through what they see and hear, etc., etc., and using that and adapting to that to allow both life forms, if you like, to perform as effectively as possible in whatever task they're provided with. Is that have I oversimplified that terribly, or is it somewhere in the ballpark?
No, it's definitely somewhere in the ballpark. Somewhere in the ballpark. And then the rider, should provide handrails for shaping the horse's performance that would be, in engaging the horse to, and horses learn to learn as well. But if I go back to that quickly, definitely what tends to happen is riders who do that are labelled as talented and having feel. and the ones that aren't talented and don't have feel are told that they need the technical information so that they can survive not being talented and not having feel. And it's and then this is the bit that, again, in my first article, I was going, we say that people who are elite performers, have got poor technique, or they've forgotten how to learn, or they're doing it all wrong, or they make, and I'm thinking that doesn't make sense. That I'm not buying that anymore. Maybe we're not trying to teach it right. Maybe you're getting hung up on this perfect, technical template, telling people what shape to make with their body is the bit that's not right. What happens if we listen to them? And if they haven't got a cat in hell's chance of becoming talented and developing feel if all we're doing is telling them to focus on their hand position or what their heels are doing. If we're pulling their attention to something technical that we think is a technically correct thing to do, then because they're doing that, they can't also be attending to what the horse is doing. Now, the difficult thing with a horse is that it's, you then need to go, that search space needs to be an appropriate size. So if you're a beginner, you need to be on a horse that's fairly solid and reliable and well trained, which always used to happen. So a beginner horse then leaves you with a not very good learning environment.
So you talked about, we mentioned this earlier on, that the goal often in training is to trick the horse or to reduce disobedience. And there's this terminology around, they call them a bomb-proof horse or an honest horse. Talk me through that.
Yeah, so there's and again, there's a lot of challenge to this, which is brilliant, and the really good horsemanship recognises that that's not good. So traditionally you would break a horse in, and the idea of breaking a horse is that you break its spirit, so that it doesn't fight anymore, so that it's going to live in a stable and stand there for 23 hours and then do endless circles in a school for an hour. This is a big example. This is the worst case scenario. Not be interacting with other horses, not being able to run around and play and do the stuff that it needs to do as a horse. So, and then they develop all sorts of, problems that they're then told that they've got vices. And these vices are just, stress stereotypies that you would see in a human who's incarcerated as well. So, because the horse was a utilitarian, the people didn't worry about, whether they were having a good time or it was good for the horse. And that's changed very much. So all of the good horsemanship now realise that actually a bomb-proof horse is one that's just been shut down. It's got learned helplessness. And Andrew McLean, who does, like I say, the most amazing thing with ISIS, talks about there's research on learned helplessness within dogs, obviously, that was done a long time ago, and in humans. You can't research it because it's unethical to give any animal learned helplessness for the sake of science, but you can, he's saying we can assume that is what they have. And so these horses that people think are brilliant and they're bomb-proof are actually just shut down completely. The difficulty there is that they do tend to break, either psychologically or physically. They break, and a lot of horses don't last the lifespan that they should do. There are other things in there as well in the training, but they're not lasting that lifetime. And an honest horse within jumping is a horse that will jump, so it won't duck out or stop. But, and I was saying there, it's actually, an honest horse is actually not an honest horse. An honest horse is one that has got that level of learned helplessness, that it knows that if it doesn't jump, it's going to get punished. So it will jump whether or not it sees the affordances to jump. So, however badly it's presented, it'll still jump. And while those ideas and that language is embedded so deeply within the sport, it's very hard to move away and change things, because there's this sort of thought process that if you give the horse a little bit more autonomy, then it will become dangerous. But the evidence is you've got all these thousands of kids, particularly on Instagram, riding their horses around, bareback and bridleless and doing amazing stuff. And, and they're the ones that are not having accidents, and their horses are loving it, and playing, because they are incredibly intelligent. They're more like, I always think my horses are like my collie, but smarter. And if I can get them engaged in playing, they love it. They're just, yeah.
So you gave a really good quote from was it Rainer Klimke? The horse is not a piece of a sporting equipment; it is your partner. Yeah. And then Charlotte Desjardins about the idea of it's the dance between the horse and rider, and it feels to me like that you're trying to create a scenario where horse and rider are playfully, like you say, dancing or creating a kind of movement repertoire together.
Yes.
It's almost, it felt, when you were talking about it, an image popped into my mind of almost like ice dance, because there's a lot of trust between, so for example, if one partner throws an individual into the air, and the trust is that they'll catch them,
and stay upright.
and stay upright and all that sort of stuff. So, but that requires both parts of that partnership to connect equally and devise that movement together in order to be able to go through that journey together, I suppose. So it's kind of an interesting conceptualization, rather than there's one in control and in command and the other one is a more submissive recipient of commands and orders, and that's how it works.
Yes, yeah, no, that's brilliant. That's a brilliant analogy, and really good. I do like that. and it is, but obviously the human is the one who's making the decision. Some people say that you have the casting vote. So if it's a 49-51, the horse might want to just stay in the field and have a snooze with his mates rather than go and go for a ride or jump. So, but again, they're very much about engaging the horse and coming and doing something with you, where the horse has handrails and not handcuffs, where the horse, and again, the lady I was judging for today was saying she loved that bit of the handcuffs, handrails analogy. She's saying rein contact needs to be like handrails, doesn't it, Marianne? So that the horse is connected, but it can still organise its own movement if it needs to.
That's interesting, isn't it? So I was just thinking about that from the perspective of, one of the things that attracts me so much to the kind of ecological approach is that it asks the coach. So I'm thinking about, I'm in a dance to a certain extent with the participants that I'm engaged with. And in the past, I think I probably saw myself as a conductor. Maybe worse, not a conductor, maybe, an instructor. So at least a conductor, there is an interaction, but it's still, I'm in command, you're playing. And one of the things about the ecological approach, and again, this refers to sort of, Dominic Orth research and people like that, is you place yourself alongside the learner, right? And I use the word, so you can sometimes think of that as being like a guide, a navigator, or you can place yourself alongside the learner or with the learner on a journey, and I describe that as a sense maker.
Yes.
So you're with a group of individuals or an individual, and you're providing a little bit of a framework to help them make sense of their own experiences, or make sense of their lived experiences. And in this case, you haven't got the benefit of language.
Yeah.
But what you have got is the benefit of, for example, sensation and feel and touch and all those sorts of things.
Yeah. And they learn by reward, and they learn by touch and release and pressure and things. And, we don't have language with a dog, but we can do amazing things with them as well in shaping that behaviour.
By the way, I need to find out a bit more about that, because the dance between Flo the dog, our puppy, and myself is not always the most graceful one, I have to say. Although, since we found Squeaky Ball, we're having a much better time. Our dancing has got a lot better.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's having a reward. There has to be something in it for them. And I remember, because I had my last dog I trained as a search and rescue dog with Sada, and they said to me, the first thing you need to do is get your dog absolutely hooked on a toy, an interaction with you that they can't do without you. Because otherwise they'll just go off and do their own thing when they get bored of a search. It's
interesting.
She is a bit the same.
Yeah, it's interesting. She flows like that. To begin, because she's a puppy and she grew up in an environment full of other dogs. The breeders we got from, they had loads of different breeds of dogs, and she got to be with them all the time, and you could just tell she just loves it. So the biggest challenge we've had with her is she'll just always go and play with another dog, because that's the most fun thing she can possibly do. But as we're now playing and Squeaky Ball and everything else, that's becoming less interesting for her. So her desire to go has become less. And so she comes back. So it's not, because there was no treat in the world. I tried everything, right? No treat in the world would bring her back when, because you don't always want her to run off to somebody with a dog that you don't know. They might not like it, or the dog might not be particularly receptive. So, and what I'm finding now is that, Squeaker the ball, and it's like, oh yeah, he's got the ball, let's go and do the ball again. So it's kind of interesting how, that I'm sort of just exploring that with her a little bit.
While you're saying that, I'm thinking about that with the coaching, and the idea that you want someone to have this perfect technical template, but actually where they're at is completely different. They're building basic, maybe postural tonus. So you set them up to fail by expecting that template.
Yeah.
One of the things they used to say in SADA a lot of the time was, never set your dog up to fail. So they go, if your dog does run after another dog, because you haven't had it on the lead or you haven't anticipated it, then there's no point telling it off, because that's where it is now and what's most important.
Yes.
But try not to be in that environment where that happens. So you're not setting your dog up to fail. And if you do, and that, sometimes dogs would have a fight and somebody would go to tell off the one that started it. And one of the really good SADA handlers said, no, he didn't start it. He was doing, stink eyes at the other dog. And it all started silently and through posture, just because you didn't notice.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't tell them off if you haven't, you can't intervene because you didn't see enough of what happens. So that was really interesting. So, and as your dog gets older, then it's in a different place. But while it's most important to play with puppies, and that's so, there is nothing to be gained by telling your dog off for doing it, is there?
No.
And it was interesting because I was thinking that is the same kind of thing as going, do you know what, at that moment in time, where somebody is where they're at, and there's nothing to be gained by trying to make them look like this technically perfect adult male Olympic performer. Which is why
for me, placing yourself alongside them so that you can begin to get that kind of intuitive feel for where they are and where their action possibilities and action capabilities and perceptual connection with whatever it is they're seeing in the environment, and then you can begin to manipulate that information. Is how, for me, is that reconceptualization of the way in which we're going to engage in that learning journey. And the more I think about it, the language of dance really fits, because, and actually the more I think about it, the more I think there is to learn about this dance between the rider and the horse, in the sense of you have to do that. You don't have the benefit of instruction. You can't necessarily, I mean, I know instruction, I know a horse will respond to commands, but it's not as if you can ask a horse what it's seeing, feeling, you just have to sort of begin to develop that genuine connection with this organism in order to begin to sense, or at least, get an understanding of how they're responding to certain stimulus, how they're responding to certain perceptions in environmental information, etc., etc.
Yeah. And I think that, like I say, brilliant horse people do that. And there's a lot of niche, different people around the world doing that. But without having something like the ecological dynamics perspective that gives it a scientific framework, it will never become mainstream. And that's, I know it's rather ambitious, but I'm glad if I just start opening that box, then that's, that would be brilliant. And it might mean that some of the way that competitions run need to change, the expectations that the horse is this machine that you can just program and then sell, or, get some ribbons. And that is because our equestrian sports operate because they have a social license. And you talked about a carrot-shaped stick, didn't you, and yours? And I thought, social license is our carrot-shaped stick. There you go. We don't want somebody who thinks that no one should ever interact with a horse to get them banned. Because, like McLean, I think that horses do. And this might be, a slight off-piste thing, but there is definitely something about moving in a way that is fluid and powerful that, everybody who does a sport describes that just systemic jolt of sheer joy of doing, whether it's jumping a bike, or skiing a really good line, or, making a really nice move on a boulder wall. There are some movements that seem to have this sort of fluidity that make that almost a sheer joy in themselves. Does that make sense? And I'm sure other sports have it as well. Yeah. They're almost like you just get this incredible, boost of neurotransmitters that just go, that's awesome. And horses behave like that as well in many ways. When they're posturing and then playing and they're messing around, and they have an opportunity to do that with people. We've taken them out of a wild environment, and Andrew McLean says that if we get it right, the way in which we interact with them gives them back some of that interaction and play and joy of somebody's knocking downstairs, of joy of movement that they seem to engage in the same way that we do. Again, without sort of testing them, but you look at just the way in which they express and move, and you go, that's joyful movement.
The possibilities. The more you talk about it, I'm starting to, needless to say, my head's starting to go. But the possibilities for environment design to facilitate playful and exploratory engagement for horse and rider I mean, it's like this endless, like, kind of like a tapestry of amazing opportunities to be able to design those things. And I mean, I can understand why you were attracted to this as a concept. I mean, pulling out the coherent themes and messages is going to be the significant challenge, I guess, is it not?
It is, and keeping it tight enough to get a PhD out of it. But hopefully, if I can get some funding for the PhD, would be brilliant. But hopefully, I can then work in between doing other bits that are also interesting. So because there is so much in there. But I think that, it's almost vital. I don't think equestrian sports can move forward without having something. And I think the ecological dynamics, obviously I'm biased, is the only thing that will give it that background and structure to move forward. And, and there are so many people who are passionate, they're just, it's like everything else, it's always a bit tough before there's a change, isn't there? And the judges that, people say that the judges, the problem, and they score poor riding and things like that. But every time I write for a judge, they're like, I don't want to give this a good mark. It's not okay. We need to change something. So there's definitely, it does feel exciting, like with the ecological dynamics anyway. It feels like there is, it's an exciting time for change and to be able to influence change.
One thing I left as a piece of reflection from the conversation from the talk that you gave, though, I thought was, again, I'm going back to this idea of almost like that kind of counter intuition, because when you enter this dance and you release, for example, you have to give yourself to a certain extent, don't you? It's almost
Absolutely.
like a loving relationship in many ways. It's not a truly loving relationship unless you give yourself, and trust only comes from giving, and all those sorts of things. But in so doing, then there is this also that huge level of vulnerability, in the sense that, you're leaving your I guess the fate of either your life, or suppose, or the performance possibilities in the hands of another that you may feel, or people may feel, is unpredictable. So I sort of understand why people's default is to control, and I think this is true of lots of different aspects of performance, where when somebody doesn't perform well, right, we're going to double down on the control, right? We're going to be more controlled, more structured, more ordered. Or psychologically, if, for example, we've got some sort of mental blockage or something, right, we need to find a way of controlling that, managing, structuring, as opposed to exploring what that genuinely means for us. So which is sort of the release, the
release.
Giving, so it's that kind of like to be, okay, well, we've had a little bit of a failure here, or we've had a little bit of, we're in the ugly zone, we've had a little bit of a minor catastrophe because, something didn't happen in the performance context, or there was an accident and, the horse stopped and the rider comes off. All right, well, the answer to that is to be more vulnerable. I can so understand how people would go, whoa, no, that's just, no, it's the opposite. You've got to do this. So you're almost having to deprogram some learned behaviors in humans that are almost like endemic within our culture around command and control, aren't we?
Yes, yeah, definitely, I agree. And it doesn't mean, it's not about you talk about having to trust, but I wouldn't. It's not about trusting them when you shouldn't do. There are definitely things you shouldn't trust, because you're setting the horse up for fail then, aren't you? You're not going to let go of your puppy when there's like loads of other dogs on the other side of it and go, I trust you not to run over there.
Yeah, okay.
Clearly that's not going to work. So it's, again, setting up the environment and the search space for the horse at that time and going, what is the block? And a lot of the time, I use a phrase, I don't know if you're familiar with it, of icing raw cakes. People do a lot of icing raw cakes. So you go, you need to fix something, don't put a bigger bit on, or don't faff around with, if you're paddling with finding a sweet spot for your blade. That's not the bit that's not working. You need to come back and fix what wasn't there. It might be if I give you an example, I was lunging. So my horses, I do quite a lot of loose work with them so that they can spend time moving around without me riding them. And where I've brought them, there's a lunge pen that's got a wooden wall and it's slats with gaps in. So it's quite spooky and echoey in there. And I took one of my horses, the 10-year-old, who's the daughter of the other one, in, and she's a little bit more feisty and the kids were playing in a tree next to it, and she was really distracted by them, and she kept looking over, and I was waiting for her because I thought, I can't start working until I've got her attention, because she's in the ugly zone already, and without me even doing anything. So I don't work. I'm like you calling the puppy when it's when it's running off. So 40 minutes I waited, and she still hadn't really relaxed enough for me to work her, so I put her away. Did the same thing the next day, and she was still looking around, and I thought, do you know what, I need to get her where I can actually start a connection. So I got a mum out, because her mum's really chilled. She's 20. She's the one you see me riding on the beach with no bridle and no saddle or anything, swimming in the sea, and I just let her loose, and her mum just wandered over, had a little roll, and then sort of cocked her leg and stood in the corner. And the daughter just looked at her and went, "Oh, you're chilled, me too," and then came over to me to come and play.
Right.
She knew I had some carrots and stuff, so that was brilliant. So that's an example about, I had to change the environment quite drastically to be able to get her back to where I could work on what I wanted to work on, in terms of her to do some physical lunge work to strengthen her up. I had to change things to get her mentally and emotionally and in the right place. I had to create an ugly zone to play in, because she'd already filled it with other stuff. So sometimes it just it's I, like everything else, identifying what really is the rate limiter at that moment in time, and then working on that, and that might mean changing the plan you had completely. And
sometimes I think what you've also talked about there is something that I find is interesting, is creating a strong enough attractor.
Yes, absolutely.
And I sometimes find myself quite surprised at, I've designed, kind of a thing where there's a big attractor, and I think, oh yeah, we'll see loads of action possibility in that space because of the attractor. It's not strong enough.
Not strong enough. Yeah. and then you need to do things like you say, okay, do I need to then disrupt whatever else is there, so you can disrupt the other one, or you try and find other ways to build a stronger attractor, and then it might be things you've never thought of that are more extraneous, so but that requires a different way of thinking, and is currently done in most coach things, isn't it? That's
sometimes it's strengthening the attractor or keeping the attractor as strong as it is, but I have to bring the detractor next to it. Yeah. So that's the attractor isn't strong enough, because on its own it's not strong enough. So I might have to bring in a detractor. So, for example, if
Which is what I did with a mom.
Yeah. Well, exactly.
What I did.
Yeah. Oh, she's getting all the carrots. Right. I better get involved in this.
Yeah. And I can chill because she's here. So I've created a space then that's attractive for her, rather than one that's not. Now, so her mum was there, and I was, and the carrots. Now that's suddenly a much more attractive space.
Yeah. And then, so I was thinking, so as another potential, so for me in my environment, the detractor might be, there's some form of consequence.
Yeah.
Which might mean that, oh, right, now that becomes more valuable, so we're going to be more attractive. Or I might, for example, change the environment to say, I'm thinking of cricket actually, I'm trying to get, for example, or encourage shots to be played on one side, because naturally the individuals wanting to hit the ball the other way, because it's a developed movement for them. So they now want to explore an alternative, but there's not, so you give points on one side that are more than over there, or you don't get any there, you get more over here.
Yeah.
And but I'm not really getting much success there, so I'm going to go back to this. Well, sometimes I have to say, right, well, if you go there, you're out.
Yeah.
Or that detractor now really strengthens that attractor.
That one. Yeah.
So it's like you're sort of pushing and pulling sometimes using different environmental influences.
Yeah, definitely. And or moving between things. So you can do some there and go back, and try to think of examples. Things like I used to have a table tennis table in the living room. I'm not very good at table tennis, and we ended up playing with 2 bats, and had a game where you had to change hand each time.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't very good at backhands and other things, and I thought it's really boring just saying that you have to have a backhand. So actually, we made it much more interesting, and saying that, you know, if you hit with your right, the next time you have to hit with your left. So whatever you end up having to do, you have to do. And then because some of them were the good ones and some of them were a bit more creative, it got really fun. So it wasn't a prescriptive. It has to be, you know, a backhand with this. And actually, I don't think any of us play with 1 bat anymore, because it's far more fun doing it with 2.
I love it.
But that's an example of actually just disrupting the whole pattern, so that it's all mixed up. So the bits that are nice are still mixed up in the bits that, you know, the bits you get to do the ones that you can do in between the other ones. And sometimes it's just about being a bit more creative and then going back and playing. And
that's the beauty of these sort of fascinating exploratory moments, is that you get these sort of, you know, these moments of discovery that are like, wow, I never would have come up with that. The participants just, you know, found this moment, and you just think to yourself, I just don't want to ever rob them of that. And I certainly don't want to rob myself of those moments, because they're really joyful.
Yeah. I don't, and that's a really good point, that participants, I've always, you know, when I coach, I always like to think that I might start off, with, you know, shaping a session a little bit more, and I love that idea about walking with somebody, but towards the end of it, I want to be partaking in their session, and especially with kids, I want to be joining in their games, their ideas, they're shaping it. They're going to go away, you know, partly with lots of autonomy about what they do, you know, because they've had so much more input. And so I always feel, you know, like towards the end, it needs to be much more, I'm learning and picking up things and just sort of being more a facilitator of, you know, of the activity, for sure.
Fascinating. Well, you have you love a challenge, clearly, and you have by all means, you have all my admiration as you embark on this journey of learning, discovering what it means to apply an ecological framework to the world of equestrian. You write beautifully. I have to say, I'm slightly envious. No, that's not true. I'm really envious. I haven't blogged for a long time, and I feel like that's a skill set that's atrophied. But I've actually been reading your stuff with great interest. And I know that you're always willing to help others and are actively involved in, you know, kind of coach development and learning as well. So if people want to reach out and find out more about, you know, kind of your experiences or learn from you, whatever it might be, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Okay, so I do try and do social media. I've realised actually it's quite important in this day and age. So so my Twitter handle is @dynamicscoach, and then it's I1. We ran out of numbers, and I'm on Facebook as Dynamics Coaching, and then some people I work with have put up a Ugly Zone Rocks page, which I don't actually organise, but it's sort of a bit more of a community page. So, or I can be contacted at Hartbury or certainly through Sheffield. So, and
there's a book as well.
I'd love to. If I could get somebody to help fund one, I'd definitely write a book. That would be my dream. That would be my absolute dream. I keep thinking I should ask Ian Renshaw. He likes my blogs, which is really nice. That definitely when I got a message from him saying I pass on your blogs to my Skillac students group, and I've used the Ugly Zone. You know, I'm thinking of using the Ugly Zone one in one of my lessons. I was like, right, I've died and gone to heaven.
I mean, it's a great accolade, isn't it? I know, for example, that my podcast gets shared by various academics teaching Skillac, and it's a great accolade. However, there's a little part of me thinking, hang on a second, we're doing their jobs for them here. This is an on.
Then they should fund it. No, I'd love to. I do want to write a book, and you know, there's most of it's mapped out.
It's just a bit like me, just doing it. I've been threatening to do it for years, but not quite there yet.
It's just being able to afford to, you know, more than anything. But I'd love to, and hopefully, I think because, like I said, I think because I span lots of different things, I still don't, you know, I don't think my writing's anywhere near as good as I'd like it to be, but it's a work in progress, and I'm, you know, and it's going the right way. But I think that I span a lot of different areas, and you know, and I think maybe sit outside of the box of where most people would write from. You know, like I say, I'm not an elite athlete. I'm a woman who's worked in a very male orientated environments, with whether it's mountain rescue or the other things. And so I think it's just a different perspective that hopefully would be interesting.
Definitely. Well, I can attest to that. I've heard you speak, and I've very much enjoyed this conversation. Marianne, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, I love your podcast as well. So keep up the good work.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Done.
Fabulous. It's all right.
Yeah, absolutely perfect. Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.